Everyone knows Disney is a master at creating incredible and emotional movies.
I'm so sorry.
But do you have any idea what these films were like in their early versions? Let's give you a heads up, they were all very different from their final versions. Inside Out is a massive hit, and one of its biggest strengths is definitely the story itself and the characters representing Riley's emotions, but all of that could have been completely different. In the first movie, there are 5 emotions: joy, sadness, anger, fear, and disgust. But what if, instead of just 5, Riley's mind had more than 20 emotions? Believe it or not, the production team actually considered this, but they quickly changed their minds and stuck with just 5. And thank goodness for that. With so many characters, it would have been hard to give them all the attention they deserved. Funny enough, Inside Out 2 ended up introducing 4 more emotions, bringing Riley's total up to 9, which is still less than half of what the original film was supposed to have. But Inside Out 2 also planned to include other emotions, like guilt, jealousy, and embarrassment. Could we see these characters and more in the future of the franchise? Will Riley's mind end up more crowded than a rush hour bus? If that happens, her poor brain is going to be a total mess. But if they introduce new emotions little by little in each movie, we'll get to know each one properly. If there had been 20-something emotions causing chaos in the first film, the story would have been completely different. But that's just one of the 8 Disney movies that would have turned out totally different. So get ready, because Cinewave is just getting started. Not everyone knows this, but Frozen is based on a fairy tale called the Snow Queen. But the story is very different because Elsa is actually evil in that version. Originally, Frozen was going to be much more faithful to the source material, meaning Elsa was supposed to be a true villain instead of a misunderstood character. She and Anna wouldn't even have been sisters, they would have been rivals. In other words, Frozen was meant to follow a more classic Disney storyline, where the protagonist is a kind-hearted princess and the antagonist is an evil queen. But everything changed during the creation of Let It Go, the film's most popular song, and honestly, one of the best Disney songs ever. When the team behind the movie heard the song, they realized it suited a good-hearted person much more than a cold, heartless villain.
Let it go, let it go.
If Disney movies usually change a lot during development, it was no different with Wish, which was made to celebrate the company's 100th anniversary. One of the characters that went through the most changes was Star. In the movie, he's an adorable little mascot, the kind you'd expect to see in an Illumination film. But originally, he was going to be able to turn into a person. Actually, he could transform into anything. And here's the craziest part. Another idea was that he would be Asha's love interest. But in the end, they decided to make him less human. Another change that would have completely altered the movie was that Asha's grandfather was supposed to die during the story, and then Star would take on his appearance, only younger. This idea was considered before the whole romance with Asha thing, but both concepts were ultimately scrapped. Another character who was almost drastically different was Queen Amaya. Instead of being kind, she was going to be an accomplice in King Magnifico's evil plans. That means we would have had the first villain couple as the main antagonists of a Disney movie. And as if that wasn't enough, the two would also have had an evil cat named Charo. Honestly, all these scrapped ideas actually sound pretty interesting. Do you think Wish could have been better if Disney had kept some of these changes? Or do you prefer the final version of the movie? Comment below with #different and share your opinion. Believe it or not, Moana went through so many changes that in the beginning, the story wasn't even about a navigator. Originally, the protagonist of this movie was supposed to be Maui. In fact, the story was going to be called Mighty Maui. In this version, Moana would have just been a companion to the demigod on his journey to save his boyfriend. Everything changed after the 2 directors of the movie took a research trip to Polynesia to learn more about the local culture. After the trip, the film was completely rewritten from scratch. Because of that, Maui was no longer the main character and Moana took his place. But even then, a lot was still different from the final version. The navigator would have had 9 siblings, and the reason her father didn't want her to sail wasn't because of his past experiences, it was simply because Moana was a woman. She wouldn't have left home to return the heart of Te Fiti, but instead to save her father and brothers, who had disappeared while sailing across the ocean. Heihei was in the movie from the very beginning, but he was completely different. You know the goofy, clueless rooster we all love? Originally, he was supposed to be a very serious rooster who followed Moana around as her bodyguard. Imagine seeing a tough, no-nonsense Heihei. That would have been awesome, but let's be honest, the goofy rooster in the final version is way funnier. Did you know that Woody and Buzz Lightyear could have been completely different? That's because the main character of Toy Story was originally going to be a ventriloquist dummy dressed as a cowboy, and Woody's partner wasn't going to be a modern astronaut hero. Instead, his sidekick was supposed to be a tin toy named Tinny, the main character from Tin Toy, a Pixar short film made before Toy Story. And instead of fighting for Andy's attention, the two would have gone on a journey to get to a daycare center, a place where there would always be kids to play with toys. This idea at least seems to have been partially reused in the plot of Toy Story 3. The reason they completely changed the main characters was that the ventriloquist dummy was kind of creepy and might have scared kids. As for Tinny, Pixar decided to replace him because they thought it would be more interesting if Woody's partner was a more modern toy, probably to make the two characters very different from each other. And that's how Buzz Lightyear was born, a state-of-the-art action figure with all kinds of cool gadgets. Zootopia already tackles themes of prejudice, but its original version was so dark that Disney had to change most of the story. Seriously, originally, all predators were supposed to wear shock collars that zapped them whenever they felt strong emotions. This was going to be a major plot point. The collars were supposedly meant to stop predators from getting angry and losing control, but in reality, they wouldn't even be able to feel happiness without immediately being shocked. In other words, the discrimination against predators was going to be way more intense. Nick Wilde was supposed to be the main character, while Judy Hopps would have had a much smaller role. The movie would have followed Nick as he secretly ran a fake medical clinic that helped predators escape to a hidden park where they could finally be free from their collars. The villain also went through major changes. In the final version, we have Bellwether, the sweet-looking sheep who turns out to be the real wolf in sheep's clothing. Except, well, she's actually a sheep. But originally, the villain was supposed to be a pig named Swinton. She was going to be the mayor of Zootopia instead of Mayor Lionheart, and she was obsessed with achieving the perfect face. Zootopia could have been way more interesting, but its story would have been way too dark for a Disney animated movie, and it definitely would have scared a lot of little kids. So what do you think? Would you have liked to see this version, or would it have traumatized you? Honestly, I'd love to see it, and I'd definitely be traumatized. But lucky for you, our videos can cure all kinds of trauma, so subscribe to the channel. We've got new videos every day.
Thank you.
What if I told you that Disney artists imagined two completely different versions of Tangled before landing on the final one, and the first one was practically a whole other movie? To give you an idea, the story was originally supposed to start in the real world with two teenagers from San Francisco, Claire and Vince, who absolutely hated each other. Then, they'd get transported to a fairy tale world where they'd end up inside the bodies of Rapunzel and a prince. Meanwhile, the real Rapunzel would be turned into a squirrel and the prince would become a dog. At that time, the plan was to make the film in 2D animation, but since 3D animation was starting to gain popularity, Disney decided to change direction. As we all know, this entire script was scrapped in favor of a story that actually adapts the classic Rapunzel fairy tale. However, the concept of the real world colliding with a fairy tale universe was later used in Enchanted, which, by the way, is a really fun movie. In the next version of Tangled, the story was much closer to what we see in the final film, but it had a much darker tone. The biggest difference? Rapunzel was going to be mute, making her the first Disney princess with a disability. The entire movie would have taken place inside the tower, and she wouldn't escape until the very end, unlike in the final version where she leaves with Flynn Rider early on. Speaking of Flynn, in this version, the thief's name was Bastian, and he looked completely different. While Bastian was eventually scrapped, you might have noticed that Disney reused his character design for Kristoff in Frozen. Even Monsters, Inc. went through some major changes before becoming the hit movie we know today. The original story was supposed to take place in the human world, with a 30-year-old man as the main character. He would be unhappy with his life, and then the monsters he used to draw as a kid would suddenly come to life and start following him around. The twist? Only he could see them, so he'd start to think he was losing his mind. Sounds like a horror movie, right? But actually, the monsters would represent his childhood fears, and over time, he'd befriend them. As a result, they would slowly start disappearing. The next version of the movie was much closer to the final product, but still had some big differences. The protagonist would have been a monster named Johnson, who was terrible at scaring kids. One day, on a mission, he'd accidentally bring a little girl into the monster world. Since her door had broken, Johnson would have had to take care of her. At first, he'd even use her to scare other kids, because, ironically, she was scarier than he was. But when her door was finally fixed, Johnson wouldn't tell her, just so he could keep using her help. Of course, the girl would eventually find out, leading to a big fallout between them, before they finally made up. Then the other monsters would discover that Johnson had been hiding a human, and they'd start hunting them down. To escape, Johnson and the girl would jump through her door back into the human world. But right after they made it through, the door would break, leaving Johnson stuck in the human world for good. And the ending? That would have been the sweetest part, because instead of saying goodbye, the monster and the little girl would live together as best friends until they both grow old. We've got 2 awesome videos on your screen right now. Just click on the one that interests you the most. Thanks for watching, and see you next time!